Hello, I'm Marilyn Hall. Welcome to part 6 of making a dirndl. We've been working on making a bodice for my granddaughter Reese, and we've already got the skirt made, and we're going to put it together today after we get it fitted to her. So we're going to get started. Okay, I've got my granddaughter Reese here, and so what I did was I turned her bodice inside out, and I pinned the seam allowance as I would have it. I put the pins pointing down in the armholes and pointing up here so that nothing will poke her, because people don't like getting poked. Right, Reese?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to try this on, and it's inside out. Go slow. There's a couple pins on there. And then we're going to make sure that it's not too tight or too loose. Okay, now I'm going to leave a little seam allowance, a ½ inch for the zipper here. Okay. Now if this was a woman's dress, I would be adding boning into this seam, which I'll show in the next dress I do how to do boning. Okay, so I'm going to put a couple pins here. Now, Oktoberfest is many months away, and so this little girl should grow a little bit, and so I'm going to leave the dress not being much tighter than this. Okay, I have to do a pin under here. Lift your arm up. So I have these seams over here a little bit more than a ½ inch, and I would say if I was doing this dress for myself, I'd do it quite a bit tighter. So there's quite a bit of ease here. Which, is that comfortable for you?
Yes.
Okay, turn around. Let me see the back. Yep, it looks like it fits you pretty nicely. And when you move your arms around, like pretend like you're dancing with me, does it poke you here too much? No, that's important because it's really annoying when it pokes you in the armhole. So does that feel good for you?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So we're gonna call that good, and then we're gonna put the skirt on and we're gonna put in the zipper. Okay, I've taken the side seam and matched it up right at the top, and then I went down like this, and then I noticed that the front little piece is about 1/4 inch longer, so I'm going to trim it up, and then I'm going to take my serger and finish off and clean off these edges and make sure everything's even. Now if you don't have a serger, you can zigzag it or finish it off with double fold bias tape or anything that will look nice. Okay, I finished off all of my edges with my serger so they're nice and clean, and I've lined them up. Now I pinned my seam allowance, and I know that it's a ½ inch in, but I put the pins sideways because I like to do it that way. It's easier to pull them out when I'm sewing, so I'm going to go ahead and sew that side seam now. Okay, I'm ready to sew this side seam. I pinned it together, and when I start, I usually start in about a ½ inch, and I start by going backwards, and then I switch directions and go forward over that same stitch line, and I've got a ½ inch seam allowance. When I get to the end, I'm going to go to the end and then back stitch again, and then I'm done. In step 3, when I was sewing the lining to the bodice, when I did those edges by sewing them the way I did, this is why, is so that now I have a really nice clean edge, and if I need to take it in or take it out, nothing frayed will be happening here. It'll look really pretty even on the inside. And it'll be real easy even if you have to take the seam out to really close to the edge, because maybe you're a very much bigger person. You never worry about it ripping out. Then you go to the ironing board and you iron that seam allowance open, and I'm actually going to take my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch right along this line here. You can tack it in by hand if you want, but I think it's going to be just fine if I do it with the sewing machine. After ironing the seam allowance with the armholes open, I'm just going to stitch across it and sew it in place so that it'll stay open. And this stitching will not show. It's going to be inside of the seam where I sew the skirt on. Okay, this is 1/2 of the bodice, and this would be where the zipper is on one side, right where I'm pointing, and then this would be the front, and then this is the side seam, and then this is the center back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of just put this next to the skirt. I'm going to measure it or put a mark right where the center back is, and I can see that I need to make that last pleat a little bit deeper so that it will match up just right. I'll show you that in just a second. Okay, on the center back of the bodice, I put a pin exactly where the center is, and that's where I want the seam of this back of the skirt to be. So my last pleat is right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that last couple of pins out, and I'm going to make this pleat deeper and deeper until the seam comes out right exactly where that is. So I'm going to leave about a ½ inch seam allowance where that is. I'm just going to pin it in place right now, right here. I'm going to make that last pleat really big, and so it goes under maybe a couple inches, 4 or 5 inches, and then that's going to be pinned in place. And I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side of the skirt. So I've basically made that last pleat really huge, and then I'm going to have the seam be right here, and I'm going to do it the same on the other side. I want it to be totally symmetrical. Then I'm going to sew the skirt together down the middle of the back. Now I've done basically the same thing. I pinned the raw edge of the skirt, which is not really a raw edge, it's the selvage edge. There's no fraying here. I pinned it tightly all the way across the other side of the bodice till I got to the center here. And there's that pin where I marked the other pleat. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to basically move this over where it's going to be so that it'll be just a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll just pin that in place right there. And then I'm going to unpin the couple pins on that last pleat. I'm going to tuck this extra fabric way underneath, making that last pleat super big, which just gives the extra fullness in the back. And then I'll pin that in. So the pleats look the same from the outside. This is still a 2-inch pleat, but it's just that it's going to be very, very deep. Now if you don't want to do it that way, you could just cut the extra fabric off, but I kind of like any extra fullness, and I think it just makes the skirt that much nicer. So basically the pleats are all like that. Now I'm going to take these 2 pieces of skirt and I'm going to sew them together straight up the center back, and then as soon as I get done with that, then we'll be ready to sew the skirt on. So the 2 skirt panels together up the center back, so that seam will be on the inside. Then I'm going to unpin this from the bodice, and I'm going to just stitch one time through all of these pleats just to hold them together with a single stitch. I've already serged the raw edges before I pleated them, and that way if I later on make this skirt and take the dress out or take the dress in, I'll just adjust the pleats and I just have to rip out one little seam instead of ripping out all the serged edge. And I found that's the easier way to do it. Seam. And now I'm just going to pin all of the pleats in place, but I'm going to take the skirt off of the bodice, and I'm going to do one single stitch around just to hold all these pleats in place. And then we'll come through and attach it to the bodice. Okay, I'm going to be stitching through all of these pleats now. When you do this, you need to really take care that you don't get, that none of the pleats get folded up funny underneath. So every once in a while you need to just kind of take a look and make sure that they're laying down. You can kind of feel it with your hand. I stitched all of the pleats together, and now starting in the center back, I'm going to pin it to the bodice, and so that it'll be exactly in the middle. I'm going to take the exact middle of the bodice, which is pretty obvious when you have this rickrack, and I'm going to line it up right with that seam, and then I'm going to work my way to both of the front bodice parts. Now as I'm pinning this bodice on and right sides together, I came across a couple pleats that I noticed as I sewed them that they folded down. So take care when you see that that happens to just rip them out and then sew them one more time to make sure that they're laying down flat. You don't want to have a bunch of funny little puckers like that. Got the skirt pinned on all the way around back to the front here on both sides. Now before I do this, I'm going to double check to make sure that the top corners of the bodice, I'm going to match them up, and I'm going to go down, and so I'm going to make sure that they will be precisely at the same spot. So I'm going to mark a pin kind of going horizontal on one of them. This will be this one, and I'm going to say that's exactly the length that I want my zipper opening. And I'm going to make sure that the other side is exactly that. It's just one of those little funny things that just makes your dress look more finished. And so I'm going to put a pin on the other one here. I'm going to make sure that I do both the seam allowances as close to this mark as possible. And it just looks more finished when you have it hitting exactly on the mark. So when I sew these, I'm going to make sure that each of them are right on that mark. Okay? Okay, I've got my little pin marked exactly where I want that to end. And I've got it pinned all the way around. I like to sew with the pleat side up so I can see what's happening. I want to make sure none of those pleats get folded underneath funny or something when I'm sewing the bodice to the skirt. So I'm going to do that now. I started in about a 1/2 inch from the edge. Now I'm going to go backwards, and then I'm going to go forward, right over that exact spot that I wanted it to be. I'm just going to go slow, no rush, and pull the pins out as I go. Sometimes I leave them in, you probably noticed. Bad habit of mine. Now I've sewn the entire skirt onto the bodice, and as I'm getting to the end, I'm going to make really sure that I get right exactly where this pin is, right here. That's exactly where I want to make my bodice length right there, so that matches up with the other side. Otherwise you've got zippers that don't line up, and that's just not pretty. And after I go through, I'm going to go backwards, and that will help lock the end of the stitches on. It's always kind of fun after you get the skirt on to pull all your pins off, and it's the moment of truth when you line it all up and you can look at it and see how it looks. So once again, we come to the ironing board, and I'm going to iron all of this seam allowance up, and I'm going to tack it up in a few places, and it'll help to make the pleats lay down flatter when the seam allowance is all up. Now before I get the zipper in and everything, I've ironed the whole skirt, the top of the skirt, all the pleats down flat, and I'm going to come and put pink thread in. I'm going to stitch over here. It's never going to show because the apron will cover it, and just kind of do one line of stitching to hold that seam allowance that I've ironed up, to keep it up where I want it to be. So I'm just kind of stitching close to the seam line and stitching all of the seam allowance up and making sure that the rick-rack doesn't get folded up funny. After I finish this, we'll be ready to work on the zipper. Well, that was really fun. We got the whole bodice and the skirt sewn together, and it really came out nice. So join me for part 7 where we sew the zipper in.